Hello and welcome back. In this video, we'll look at adding user authentication to our project. When accessing the app, the user will be presented with this login screen. From here, they'll be able to sign in using Google Authentication. Clicking on this button will bring up a pop-up. After logging in, we'll see the user's details showing up in the navigation, and we'll only read and write data that belongs to the user. The user will also be able to sign out of the application. Let's get started. First, let's set up authentication in our Firebase project. Back in Firebase, click on Build, then click on Authentication. Then click on Get Started. From here, you can select the type of authentication methods that you'd like to activate. You can activate one or many of these providers. In this application, we'll select Google. We will then enable Google. You can then assign a name to your project, and you need to select the support email address. After this, we can click on Save. After clicking Save, we'll see the available authentication providers. Also, we can click on the Users tab. From here, we can see the users that are registered on our project. Now that we have authentication activated for our project, let's go ahead and add it to our application. Now we need to add Firebase authentication to our Firebase config file. So in lib, go to Firebase and then open up index. Now we can import getAuth from Firebase/auth. We then need to instantiate the auth object by creating a new const called auth and then calling getAuth and passing it the app object. We also want to export this auth object. Firebase authentication will install another package. For now, I'm going to stop the development server with Ctrl+C. We will then npm install REACT-FIREBASE-HOOKS. After installation is complete, we can start up the dev server again. So what we'd like to do is, after the user has authenticated themselves, we want the user details to be available to all components within the application. As an example, we want to make the username available to the navigation bar, and in the use context where we read the financial details, we want to filter only the documents that belong to the user. So in order to make the user available throughout the application, we'll create another context store. Within the lib folder, under store, we'll create a new file. We will call this file auth context. We'll start this file off by specifying use client. We will import create context from React. Context object called auth context, which we'll export, and we'll call create context. For the default values, we'll specify the following. This context object will export a user, a loading state with the default value of false, and we'll also export two functions. The first is a handler function for logging in using Google, and the second is a function for logging the user out. We will then go ahead and create the provider function. We will call this auth context provider. This will take in the children as a prop, and this function will return auth context.provider and will pass children in between these two tags. We also need to assign a value to the provider. So for this, I'll just create a new object called values. So in values, we'll pass in a few objects. First will be the user, then the loading state, then the login handler function, and lastly, a function for logging out. Then we'll pass the value prop to the context provider, and in the value prop, we'll pass in our values object. Now we need to create these objects and functions. The first will be the user and loading states. Instead of creating these states ourselves, we'll use the package that we installed earlier. So for this, we need to import a few more things. First, I'll import the auth object from our Firebase config. Then I'll import a few things from Firebase/auth. What we need is the Google Auth Provider function, as well as sign in with pop-up. And we need the sign out function. Then from the REACT-FIREBASE-HOOKS package, we want to import use auth state. Then in our auth context provider component, we want to grab user and loading from the use auth state function. This function takes in the auth object as input. So once this component renders, it will attempt to call this function. Once this function is ready, it will return to us the details of the user if they are logged in, as well as a loading state. So at least we've got these two values available now. Let's create these handler functions. First, let's create a Google login handler function. This function needs to be asynchronous. And I'll wrap the logic in a try-catch block. If we receive any errors, we'll just throw back the error. And in the try block, we will call the SignIn with pop-up function. This takes in the auth object as its first parameter. And for the second parameter, we need to pass in an instance of the Google Auth provider. So first, let me create that object. So we'll create a const. I'll call it Google Provider. You can call this whatever you'd like. And we'll set this to new Google Auth Provider. And we need to pass in the auth object as input. So therefore, for the second parameter, we can pass in Google Provider. This function returns a promise which we need to await. Once this function runs, if it was successful, this function will set the value of user. And because the user state has changed, the application will be refreshed. And the details of user will become available to the entire application. Let's now also create our logout helper function. We'll create a new function called logout. It doesn't take any parameters as input. And the logic itself is quite simple. We'll simply call the signout function, which we imported from firestore. This function takes the auth object as input. And there's no need to await this result. After signing out, the value of the user state will be set to blank. This is all handled by the package that's been installed here. Now that we've created our auth context store, we want to make the user details and the functions available to the application. So to do this, we need to open up our layout file. And we now need to import the store by importing auth context provider from the auth context store. In the body tag, we can now wrap the entire application within the auth context provider. Note that we want to add auth context provider outside of finance context provider. The reason is that we want to give finance context provider access to the user details. This will help us to filter out the documents that belong to the user within this file. But we'll have a look at that a bit later on. After saving this, the components in our application should all have access now to the auth details. So the first change I want to make to our application is to include the user details in the navigation bar if the user is signed in. Otherwise, we do not want to show this information and this profile picture. So to do this, let's go to the components folder and then open up navigation. So the first thing we need to do is import use context from React. And we also need to import auth context from the auth context store. Then within the navigation component, we want to grab the user, the loading state, as well as the logout function from the auth context store. We do want to render a few things conditionally. As an example, the user information should only show up if the user is logged in. That's referring to this section over here. So we'll add a conditional statement here that says if the user is not null and loading is false, then we'll render out something. So what I need to do is take all of this code and add it within these brackets. Also, we want to hide the navigation as well if the user is not logged in. So for the right navigation, we can add another condition. If the user is not null and loading is false, we will return something. So what I'll do is I'll grab the logic in nav and move it into this statement. At the moment, we can't see anything because we're not logged in yet, but I'm going to change some of the logic here to dynamically show the values coming from the user object. Although we're not logged in, once we are logged in, you'll see those changes coming through. The first thing we'd want to do is change the source on this image. So I'll remove all of this. And what we'll display instead is user.photo URL. For the alt tag, I'll remove this as well and replace it with user.displayName. Because we're reading messages from Google, I've seen some error messages coming through in the past, and this line here seems to resolve any messages with fetching that image. Then lastly, we'll replace this name with a dynamic name. So instead of Leon, we'll add curly brackets, and we'll replace that with user.displayName. Then for the sign out button, we'll add an on-click event listener. And when clicking this button, we'll call the logout function, which we pulled from the auth context file. We'll be able to test this out a bit later in the application. But for now, the changes to the navigation file is complete. What we need to build next is if the user is signed out, they should be greeted with this form over here. For this form, I'll create a new component, and we'll call this component SignIn.js. We will then create a new functional component called SignIn, and this component will return a main tag. We'll give the main tag a few styles, like container, a max width of 2XL, a padding left and right of 6, and a margin of auto. We'll then add a heading tag with the text of welcome, and I'll add this little waving icon. You can find these icons in Windows by pressing the Windows key and period. Let's give this heading a few styles. We'll add a margin bottom of 6, a text of 6XL, a font of bold, text center, and that should be it. In order to see our changes, let's make a small change to the main page file. So in our root page file, let's import this new component. I'll actually add that just below the modals. So I'll import SignIn from our components. And what we want to do is, if the user is not logged in, so in other words, the user state from the auth context is null, we want to add a condition that will render the SignIn component instead of the dashboard that we see here. So we also need to import our auth context data. So below finance context, I will import auth context, and we'll import that from our stores file and auth context. Then within the component, we can add this line below the finance context imports. So from auth context, we will import user and the loading state. So what we'll do is from auth context, we will import user. So what we'll do now is just above our return statement for the dashboard, we'll add a condition that says if the user is false, then we want to return the SignIn component. So after saving this, because we don't have a logged in user, we see our SignIn form. So let's go back to the SignIn file. After this heading, we want to add another div, which will give a few styles. We'll add flex, overflow hidden, a medium shadow, a shadow color of slate 500, a background color of slate 800, and we'll round the corners with rounded to XL. So first I'll add the image. I'll just give this div a new class with a height of 52. Within this div, I'm going to add an image. I'll give this image a few styles, like object cover, a width of full, and a height of full. Then for the source of the image, so for the image, you can use any image that you'd like, but I found this image on Pixels, and you're welcome to copy the same URL. So we can see our image showing up, but it's on the left-hand side of this div. I do want these items to be stacked vertically. So in the styles, I'll also add flex column. Then below this div, I'll add another div. I'll give this div a few styles, like padding left and right of 4, padding top and bottom of 10. Within this div, I'll add an h3 tag with the text, please sign in to continue. I'll give this heading a few styles, like text to XL and text center. Then below this header, we'll add a button, and it's this button that will open up the Google pop-up for logging in. So we'll give this button some text. I also want to add a Google logo just before this text. So we'll import that logo from React icons. At the top of the file, I will import FC Google. I'm going to copy this component. And just before the text, I'll add that component. And at the moment, the logo and the text is showing up beneath each other. So I just want to add some styling to the button itself. So on the button, let's add a few styles. I'll add flex, self-start, a gap of 2, a padding of 4. I'll center the button in the middle with MX Auto. I'll add a margin top of 6, a font of medium, a text of white. I'll align everything in the middle, a background gray of 700. And I'll round the edges with rounded large. I also want to make this icon slightly bigger, so I'll add a few styles to it. In fact, only one style. We'll add text to XL. Great. So on this button, we need to add an event listener on click. So what we want to do is when we click on this button, we want to call the Google login handler function, which we added to the context file. So we need to import that function from the context store. So from React, we'll also import use context. And then from the auth context store, we want to import auth context. Then in the component function, we want to grab Google login handler from the auth context store. we can now take this function name and pass that into the onClick event of the button. After doing this, we can now test out our button. So after clicking on the button, you should see a pop-up. And then after signing in using one of your Google accounts, you should be automatically redirected to the dashboard. We can now also see our name and profile picture pulling through in the navigation, and we should be able to log out as well by clicking on sign out. After clicking sign out, we will be redirected back to this login page. Also, after signing in, if you go back to Firebase and you click on users, you should now be able to see the users that are registered on your site, and this information will show you the email address of that user, as well as the provider which they used, in this case it's Google, the date, and very important, the user ID. We'll come back to this in a second. So now that we're allowing users to register on the site, we want to add logic to only read and update documents that belong to the logged in user. Therefore, the income and expenses documents will have a reference to this user ID. So for now, what I want you to do is copy this user ID and then go back to the Firestore database. We now need to make a few changes to these documents. In expenses, if you want, you can go ahead and delete your documents. But because I don't have that many records, I'll just update the existing ones. So for each of these documents, add another field called UID, leave it as a string type, and paste in that user ID. I'll do that for the second document as well. I'll add ID and paste in the user ID. Let's do the same for income. So for income, I'm actually going to delete the entries, all except one. So for the income documents, I'll also add a new field called UID, and I'll paste in my user ID. Now, in order to make use of this UID field in our logic, we need to make the following changes. First, let's go to the finance context file. I'll just close a few of these tabs to keep things neat. So in the finance context file, we now want to use the logged in user's UID to select the records for this user. So first we need a view of the user's details. So from React, we'll also import use context, and we'll import auth context from the auth context store. Within the component, we will now import user from the auth context store. I just need to make sure to call this store and not stores. From Firebase, we need to import two new functions. So we'll import query as well as where. These two functions will allow us to perform our data selections by adding where conditions. And in this case, we'll add the user ID within the where condition. And we'll also use the user ID when adding data to the database. So first, let's change this add category function. So when adding a category, before we spread the category fields, we also want to specify a unique ID field and then pass that the user.uid value. Let's do the same thing when updating the state. So just below ID, I'll add a new field called UID, and we'll pass that the user.uid. Then we also want to update the useEffect hook. This useEffect is used to fetch the income and expenses data when the app is loaded. The first thing I want to do is to add the user to the dependency array on this useEffect, because while the user is not available, we do not want to try and fetch data. So at the top of the useEffect, I'll add a condition that says if the user is not available, then we'll simply return out of this function. Because we added the user to the dependency array, this useEffect hook will run again once the user becomes available. At that point, we'll call the income data and get expenses data functions. However, at the moment, these functions are fetching all income and expenses records from the database. So we now want to use those where conditions to only select the documents that belong to this user ID. Let's first change this get income data method. So just below the collection reference variable, I'll create another variable called Q for query. I'll set this equal to query, which we imported from Firestore. We will pass it the collection reference. Then we'll add that where function. And for where, we will filter on the UID field in the document. For the operator, we'll pass in a double equal sign. And we want to check that the value is equal to user.uid. Then, where we call getDocs, we'll replace the collection reference with this query variable instead. Now, this function will only fetch data that belongs to our user. Let's do the same for the getExpenses function. Just below the collection ref, I'll create a new variable called Q for query, and we'll check that the document's UUID is equal to the user ID. Then, for getDocs, we'll pass in Q instead of the collection ref. When we refresh the app, everything still seems to be working. Also, let's try to add a new category to test out that logic. So in Add Expenses, I'll click on New Category. I'll just call it Holidays. Let's pick a color and I'll click on Create. After clicking on Create, we can see the category over here. And we can now see that the UID of the user is added to this document. One last thing is when we create an income entry, we also want that income entry to contain the user ID field. So there are a few ways to do this. Either we could populate that user ID field within the context store, but for now, I'll just do it slightly different to keep things interesting. So we'll add this logic in our modal for adding income. Because we need the user ID, we need to import a few things from the context store. So below the finance context, I'll import auth context from the auth context store. Then, within the component itself, we will fetch user from the auth context store. Then, in the add income handler function, when we create a new income object, I'll add a new field called UID and then set that equal to user.uid. So let's test this out. I'll add a new amount and I'll add a description of salary too and click on add. So let's have a look at that new entry, salary 2, and we can see the user ID reflected on the record. So now we are only reading data that belongs to our user, and when we add new entries, those entries are added with the user ID assigned to it. Right, so now we are able to sign out of the application. We are able to sign back in. And if the user hasn't signed in before, they will automatically be registered on the application. We've now added logic as well to only read documents that belong to our signed in user and will only create documents that belong to the user as well. However, we do have a small security risk with this application. If someone was savvy enough, they could change the user ID in the front end and that way read data or change data that do not belong to them. Thankfully, Firebase makes it very easy to control which data is accessed through the means of firestore security rules. When I open up the rules tab, we don't really have much in terms of rules. This rule simply says that users are able to read and access and update all documents in the database, whether it belongs to them or not. In the next video, we'll have a look at writing security rules to protect the back-end data. If you like this video, please consider subscribing to my channel and leaving a like on the video. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Bye bye.